Gitcoin, obviously an early leader in capital allocation. Our quadratic funding program has delivered about $60 million worth of funding to open source software developers in the Web3 ecosystem over the last couple years. And I see a really vast and really important design space in on-chain capital allocation that I want to talk about in this talk. And then I want to get into the solution space and how Gitcoin is preparing to accelerate and elucidate the design space. So basically, I think that capital allocation is important and something that we just take for granted when we go about our day. Basic capital allocation, anything from repaying friends for a meal or paying a bill. You make hundreds of small decisions every month about where you want to spend your money. But at scale, capital allocation can become a full-time job, and it can become mirrored in rivalrous decision-making and bureaucracy. And I think that on-chain primitives have a really big opportunity in changing how we do DAO ecosystem development, scientific research, environmental and social impact, philanthropic initiatives, city, state, and country development projects, and capital formation and economic growth. The total available market here is in the trillions with a T, not in the billions. And I think that what's really cool about this is that these are only the categories that we are aware of. So if you think about when the internet was first taking off, we could not have imagined Twitter or TikTok from the 90s. And as Web3 begins to eat the world, we cannot predict the next funding infrastructure or how it's going to shatter our existing expectations or ways that we elucidate the design space currently for what is capital allocation. And so I think that this is going to be really weird and really powerful as we go on chain, because legacy capital allocation is holding us back. It's mirrored by gatekeeping, centralized power brokers that are in charge of decision making, and through the sheer act of just giving out capital in their communities are become gatekeepers and power brokers. Legacy capital allocation is not precise and not scalable. And I think that because we now have programmable, global, transparent, and open source money, we're going to be able to create on-chain capital allocation that's more accessible, democratic, evolutionary, incorruptible, transparent, and precise and scalable than was ever possible before. Okay, so blockchains are rewriting how we send money to each other. And we're going to be able to leverage the properties of blockchains in order to do better, more precise, and weirder capital allocation than has ever been possible before. I think that another way to look at this design space is by looking at the stack that we're building in the Web3 space. I myself am an Ethereum user and I would consider myself to be an EVM whisperer. And I also am a person who runs a staking node that's actually a staking node, or at least one node behind me right now as I'm giving my talk. And on top of the Ethereum network, we now have smart contracts in which we can program our values into our money. And I think that what's really cool is that over the last 6 to 10 years of Ethereum being live, we've now been able to tokenize assets across the world and put them into the ERC20 format, which I think is really, really a powerful thing for the coming wave of capital allocation. There's going to be people who are allocating these EVM-based treasuries to their communities. And on top of that, I think that there's a capacity to change how we do human coordination from first principles, leveraging the properties of blockchains. And what this all leans towards is better and more effective capital allocation and human coordination and collective action that has ever been possible before. Okay, so I wrote a book about this design space. It's called the On-Chain Capital Allocation Handbook. I want to elucidate and help people discover the emerging frontier of on-chain capital allocation and coordination. You can get the book if you want to skip to the punchline at allobook.gitcoin.co. And one of the other things that we've associated with the book is a Telegram group where you can explore the design space in real time with other people who are learning about it with you. So we've got about 120 people in this Telegram group, and they're sharing learnings and doing book clubs with each other, which has been quite fun. Okay, so that's the opportunity space. If you want to cut to the end, you can check out the Allo book. And then I want to talk about the design space, and then we'll finally get into solutioning, and that'll be my talk. So Basically, my view of the solution space is informed by Gitcoin's evolution. As I mentioned at the top, I'm one of the co-founders of Gitcoin. Gitcoin is primarily known as a crowdfunding platform that leverages quadratic funding in order to help communities fund what matters to them. We're available to help you distribute grants programs into your ecosystem, and have recently made the jump from going from just being quadratic funding to also being making available retroactive public goods funding, which we think is totally complementary to quadratic funding. We've built something called Allo protocol, which compacts the 7 years of learnings that we have from running Gitcoin into a protocol that anyone can use in their ecosystems, developers can fork and put into their app. And soon we're going to a multi-mechanism future. Okay, so the long arc of Gitcoin is exploring the capital allocation space by going from quadratic funding to quadratic funding and retro funding. And then eventually we're really excited to be going multi-mechanism. And I think that the future looks like a capital allocation Swiss Army knife, in which we make it really easy to do weird, precise capital allocation for all of the world's tokenized assets. So a little bit of history for those of you all who aren't familiar with Gitcoin. Over the past 20 quarterly rounds, we've supported the funding of public goods, enabling communities to fund their shared needs, done about 4 million unique donations to 4,000 unique projects, and have done $60 million worth of funding to public goods in the Ethereum ecosystem, which I'm very proud of. We are now bringing that capacity to the top DAOs and EVM-based ecosystems in the project, in the EVM-based ecosystem. We believe that Gitcoin grants equals growth, and so we're a growth tool for these ecosystems that are helping them allocate capital to whatever matters to them in their ecosystems. So that's a little bit about what we're doing in practice. And as I mentioned a couple slides ago, we're mostly known for quadratic funding, which was invented by Glenn Weil, Vitalik Buterin, and Zoe Hitzig about 7 years ago, and is really good at democratic capital allocation. It's really good at getting small donors and large donors to fund things together. If you're not familiar with quadratic funding, basically the idea is that you set out a matching pool and then you allocate that matching pool according to the results of a crowdfunding campaign, but you actually weight contributions more when they come from a bunch of small donors instead of a few small whales. And so the really powerful thing about that is that we're able to fund what matters to everyday people in these communities, to the poor and many in these communities. But there's an Achilles heel of quadratic funding in that it depends on strong identity systems, which we don't really have yet. And especially I feel strongly that we have to have privacy preserving identity systems. We want to be able to show that people are unique humans, but not individually dox who those humans are. And so I think it's really important to have Sybil inclusion resistance in quadratic funding, which just adds a fair amount of complexity. Buy me a beer sometime and I'll tell you about all the complexity that Sybil resistance, inclusion resistance has introduced to Gitcoin. So we've been taking an iterative approach to building a quadratic funding platform over the last 6 years or so. Basically, we're going through this loop in which we run around and we get learnings from what works and what doesn't. We work with the biggest brains in the space in order to digest those learnings and put them into design criteria for what a next round can look like, and then we iterate from there. So you can kind of think of what Gitcoin's been doing over the last 6 years as elucidating and exploring a search space and looking for a better design for how you create value with quadratic funding. Okay, so this is a search space in which we're just trying to find the global maxima. Sometimes we get stuck in a local maxima, trying to find a global maxima of how we create value for these EVM-based communities that want to fund what matters using Gitcoin grants. And I think that the big aha moment for me over the last couple of years was, holy smokes, there's not just one maxima for how to run a grants campaign or a funding campaign. This search space is actually multi-maxima. So basically, there's going to be multiple capital allocation mechanisms that are good at different things, and we should embrace that plurality of capital allocation mechanisms. Direct grants are really good at simple grants giving. Sometimes you don't need the power or the complexity that comes with quadratic funding. I think Optimism, I don't know if there's anyone from Optimism in the crowd right now, but they've just done a really good job of capitalizing on the a priori insight that retroactive public goods funding is good at retroactively rewarding contributors. It's easier to tell in hindsight what has been good as opposed to what will be good in the future. And so this was a really eye-opening moment for me as someone who's working on capital allocation oh, there's not going to be one global maxima for the best capital allocation tool that you can build. There's going to be multiple. And I want to just kind of talk about that design space for the rest of the talk, and hopefully that will elucidate the applications that are going to be available in a capital allocation operating system in the future. So retroactive public goods funding is really good at making decisions with hindsight about what goods in your community are actually providing value to the community around you. So Optimism has created this design space of retroactive public goods funding, has delivered about $100 million worth of funding in their most recent round to contributors in the Web3 ecosystem that are working on public goods, and specifically Optimism-based public goods. Another capital allocation tool that I think is really cool is called conviction voting. Basically, it's really good at bottoms-up decision making. If you don't want to hold a whole DAO vote for every decision that your DAO has to make, you can use conviction voting, which is basically a way of setting out causes that you want your DAO to work on, and then you can stake the governance token of your DAO on those different initiatives. And conviction builds over time. There's sort of this biomimetic analog to conviction voting, where neurons charge up over time and then they fire. And that's kind of what conviction voting is. If you want to run a party at Web3 Summit and you don't want to have a whole DAO vote over the $100 slush fund that you want to do, then you can run a conviction voting round, and little initiatives can pop up here and there where people can allocate capital to the things that matter to them the most based off of the amount of governance tokens that they're willing to lock up over time. So I think it's a really interesting way of allocating capital in EVM-based ecosystems. Shout out to OneHive, who's working on conviction voting, if you're out there. Let's go through a couple more of these, and then I'll start winding down from there. The next mechanism that I wanted to talk about is called self-curated registries. If anyone in the audience knows about Protocol Guild, Trent Van Epps, 0x Gorilla, and Tim Byko, shout out to y'all for inventing self-curated registries. Basically, Protocol Guild is a self-curated registry in which the members of Protocol Guild curate who else is a protocol developer in the Ethereum ecosystem. So it's got a domain that's important, software development, protocol development in the Ethereum ecosystem, and it does bottoms-up curation of that domain in order to make a list of who is a contributor to the Ethereum protocol community. And then from there, once they have one address where you can fund the entire protocol development community, then they're able to go out to VanEck and to Lido and to other people who actually have treasuries that could allocate to Ethereum core protocol development. And I think that it's really kind of very cool to see the rise of Protocol Guild, $60 million worth of funding over the last couple of years to Ethereum core development. And I'm just really excited that they've blown open this design space of self-curated registries, and also just very simple way of funding public goods. Hats off to the Protocol Guild team. Let's see. I think that I've only got about 4 minutes left, so I'll maybe start winding down my talk by just saying I'm really excited about the endless possibilities that I see for new capital allocation strategies to be built on chain. I think that there's trillions of dollars of capital available that is going to be tokenized over the next couple of years. And so because of that, I believe that as tokenization eats the world, the TAM for on-chain capital allocation is going to become really massive. Right now, we have direct grants, we have quadratic funding, we have retroactive public goods funding, we have deviants of these. We've got streaming quadratic funding, private quadratic funding. In the future, I think that we're going to see lots of strange, but also really powerful ways that we're going to be allocating capital in the future. And I am really excited to be exploring this design space and getting back into protocol development with my work that I'm doing with the Allo protocol team. So Allo is short for Allocation, and we are building a protocol that allows communities to fork Gitcoin grants or fork Optimism retro funding and recombine it into their own applications and into their own ecosystems. So basically, if you think about the 3 phases of capital allocation for any community that you're in, maybe imagine a community that you're in and think about how they've gone from accumulating capital, that can be through an ICO or an NFT sale or through a wealthy donor, through crowdfunding. And then they have to figure out how they're going to actualize their mission in the world. And that's the act of allocating capital. So basically figuring out what projects and resources you want to spend that capital on. and then there's a loop of distributing capital from there. And so basically, you can think about Allo protocol as designed around these three phases of capital allocation. The first being accumulating capital. We've got a modular software architecture that basically allows you to take ERC20 tokens and then any registry of causes and import it into Allo, which is the main part of the Allo protocol, a tool for deploying a strategy for allocating capital. So a strategy can be quadratic funding, direct grants, retroactive funding, conviction voting, grant ships, anything that you can basically program into an EVM-based smart contract, you can make into an Allo allocation strategy. And then distributing capital. So there's lots of really very amazing ways of distributing capital these days. We can do a basic Merkle distributor. We can do Drips network, Superfluid, Hedgie. There's just a bunch of really very cool tools out there for distributing capital on chain. And then routing them from bridges to bridges is another option for what we're seeing people doing in the distribution stage of these. So I see this design space in which we're going to be exploring what's possible in the future of capital allocation. And boy, what if we could just go through all the different permutations of all the different modules for different types of registries of causes and strategies for opinionated ways to distribute capital in our communities. We're going to explore the entire design space of what's possible in on-chain capital allocation by just forking out different modules and exploring what's possible here. So in closing, thank you for listening to my talk. Really sorry that I couldn't be there in person. Hope to make it there in person next year. If you have any interest in checking out more about on-chain capital allocation, you can read my book. allobook.gitcoin.co is the address, and we are going to discover the emerging frontier of on-chain coordination together. If you are in a Web3 ecosystem and you're interested in going beyond just regular grants for your ecosystem, Gitcoin does offer quadratic funding and retroactive funding for your community. So if you want to do just simple capital allocation with direct grants, if you want to do democratic capital allocation with quadratic funding, or if you want to do retroactive funding with your community, then Gitcoin's got tools, and we've got a bunch of knowledge that will help you get up and running. And if you're a developer, then please reach out to me. We'd love to get you building on the Allo protocol. That is my talk for the Web3 Summit. Thank you so much for having me. Sorry I couldn't be there in person, and hope to be able to make it there in person next year. But I'll be at DevCon, so maybe I'll see a bunch of you all then. Thanks so much for having me.